Hi, everybody. It's Peter Schiff. This is Friday, September 9th, 2011. Well, the markets gave President Obama's speech the big thumbs down today. The Dow Jones dropped by better than 300 points. You know, I happened to watch that speech, and I wanted to share with you some of my thoughts on what the president had to say. First of all, one of the things he did not say, or one of the words he did not say during his entire speech, was stimulus. And I think the reason he chose not to use the word stimulus is because his last stimulus was so unpopular because it failed so miserably. But if you listen to what he proposed this time, it's the same old policy. He simply dusted it out and brought it back, except this time he labeled it the Job Creation Act. But, you know, a rotten banana by any other name is going to stink just as badly, and that's the case here. You know, it doesn't matter what you call it, it's bad politics. And the reason the stimulus didn't work is because it contained the same policies that we're getting in this Job Creation Act. And in fact, it's something that I've long talked about when it comes to Washington and legislation, that whatever they name a bill, you know that the exact opposite is what they're going to achieve. So this is the Job Creation Act. Well, then you actually know it will end up being the Jobs Destruction Act. Because, you know, the problem when it comes to all these stimuluses, government stimuluses, is the deficits that finance the stimulus destroy more jobs than the tax cuts create. That's why it doesn't work. You're swimming against the tide. And in fact, the tide is going to win. Now, you know, the president liked to claim during his speech that all this spending is paid for. Because, of course, you know, if it's not paid for, it's a stimulus, because that's the whole concept of a Keynesian stimulus. So if we paid for it, then technically it wouldn't be a stimulus. But none of this is paid for. Paying for the tax cuts would mean offsetting them with spending cuts at the same time, so that there was no net increase in the deficit. The fact of the matter is, this plan as proposed, assuming the numbers are right, and I'm sure they're underestimating the cost, which is something that Congress often does, this is going to add $450 billion to the deficit this year. And the way the government, Obama, is proposing that it be paid for is that this special commission that's been convened to cut the deficit years into the future, well, Obama is saying, hey, while you guys are going through this exercise of mental masturbation here, why don't you come up with an extra $450 billion in phony cuts? Because remember, what is this commission going to discuss? It's going to discuss suggestions for cuts that future Congresses might make 5 to 10 years into the future. But of course, these future Congresses are not bound by anything that this Congress does. The only cuts that would actually count are the ones they make to the current year, because these are the only ones that they can actually vote for. You know, anything else isn't a real cut. And of course, it's not even a cut. What Obama is saying is, here's how we're going to pay for all the money we're borrowing to finance this stimulus in disguise. We're going to pay for all this money that we've borrowed by borrowing less money than we were planning on borrowing in the distant future. In other words, you're paying your bills by running up even bigger debts, but somewhat smaller than the debts that you were planning on running up. That is not paying for something. Paying for something means you don't run up a debt. You actually have the cash to pay the bill. But again, he doesn't want to focus on the fact that he is deliberately running up the deficit, because that would focus back on the fact that this is nothing more than a Keynesian stimulus dressed up as a Jobs Creation Act. After all, his last stimulus was supposed to create jobs, yet we still have an unemployment rate north of 9% and a real unemployment rate of better than 16%. You know, one thing is going to happen, and of course I pointed this out, when they increased the debt ceiling. They increased the debt ceiling with all that theatrics. They raised it by about $2 trillion. And the goal was so that we would have enough room to get through the next election without having to raise the debt ceiling again. Well, guess what? If they pass this bill, that throws it out the window. We will run into that debt ceiling before the 2012 presidential elections. In fact, we'll have to raise the debt ceiling again right in the heart of campaign season, probably summer 2012. That's going to be quite a hot political issue when the debt ceiling debate is looming again in that type of atmosphere. But, what I really want to talk about is all of the unintended consequences of this supposed job creation bill, because the bill really, again, doesn't create jobs. It might create more turnover in the jobs that we already have, but on balance, we're not going to add jobs as a result. Because as I've already said, the damage done by the deficits, because these deficits have to be funded. President Obama says he wants to put money into the pockets of Americans. Well, the government is broke. There's nothing in the government's pockets. What's it going to put in there? The only money it can put in one American's pocket is money it takes from another American's pocket. Or another way, the government can put money in your right pocket, but it's got to pick it out of your left pocket. But the problem is it takes more from the pocket it picks than the pocket it fills. So the net result is a loss. But what is this going to do? What are all these gimmicks? Because, again, it's all gimmicks. It's targeted tax credits. It's these one-time temporary payroll reductions. It doesn't get to the root cause, the underlying economic problems that are ruining our economy and that are inhibiting job creation. We don't get to any of that. These are just these gimmicks. So what's it going to do? One of the things that the president has proposed is a tax credit for hiring people who have been unemployed for more than 6 months. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means certainly if you just got fired yesterday, well, that's bad news for you because there's no tax credit associated with hiring you. So they want to hire somebody who's been unemployed for 6 months so they can get that tax credit. Now, of course, the tax credit, it says, is $4,000. Now, I'm not sure if that tax credit is diminished based on the level of pay. So, for example, what about a minimum wage job that's $7.25 an hour? Do you still get a $4,000 credit if you create a minimum wage job? And I think the window is you have to keep the person on your books for 6 months. You can't hire them and then fire them the next day and get the tax credit. You got to keep them there for 6 months. But if you hire somebody at minimum wage and you keep them for 6 months and you get $4,000, what that effectively does is reduce the minimum wage from $7.25 an hour to about $3.40 an hour. Now, obviously, a massive reduction in the minimum wage is going to help people find some jobs. But what I'm afraid is that some of the people that get these jobs, it's going to be based on the minimum wage workers that are fired so that their employers can hire somebody else and get this tax credit. Now, another problem, though, too, is the bill, at the same time, they are giving you an incentive to hire somebody that's been unemployed for more than 6 months. They're also giving you a disincentive to even interview anybody that's been unemployed for 6 months or longer, because the bill is going to make it illegal for employers to discriminate against the long-term unemployed. And again, this shows that the president has no idea what is destroying jobs, because here he is exposing potential employers to yet another lawsuit if they're not hiring people the way the government thinks that they should. So here's the unintended consequences. This is the way the market will react. Employers are going to look for people who have been unemployed for maybe 5 months. They'll interview them because, after all, they're not protected by the new Anti-Discrimination Act. And if they've been unemployed for about 5 months, they can offer them a job that starts right when they hit 6 months. So they'll collect unemployment benefits for a little while longer, but then they'll be able to get the full credit. They can hire them. And then after 6 months, well, they'll fire those people to make room for the new hires so they get the tax credit all over again. And, of course, some of these initial jobs will come at the expense of the people that they fire right now. So all of this is going to affect low-skill, minimum wage jobs. It's going to have no effect on real good jobs. I mean, an employer is not going to hire somebody for $50,000, $75,000, $100,000 a year to get a $4,000 tax credit. I mean, if you don't need the employee, if it's too expensive to hire them, that small tax credit isn't going to make a difference, nor will the temporary 1 year cut in the Social Security payroll tax. That is not going to make a difference. Really, to add insult to injury, or to go from the sublime to ridiculous, the President Obama actually has the nerve to say that even though they're slashing temporarily payroll taxes, that it's not going to impact this quote-unquote Social Security trust fund, because the government is going to make up all the lost revenue to the trust fund from the general revenue. I mean, think about this theatrics here that the government is going through to keep up the pretense that a trust fund actually exists. They're going to go out and borrow some money, then they're going to put it in the trust fund, and then they're going to borrow it from the trust fund and spend it on the stimulus, all to pretend that there's a trust fund. The whole thing is an exercise in futility. And you know, these tax credits, the gimmicks get even worse. If you hire somebody who is a vet, a returning vet, you get a $5,600 tax credit, which if you can apply that to a minimum wage job, reduces the minimum wage to $1.87 an hour. Now, yes, you're going to create some jobs, but again, it's only temporary. So they're not permanent jobs. These are temporary jobs. And of course, so they're not going to have any benefits or anything. And what's going to happen is people are going to get a government incentive to have a lot of turnover in their workforce. That's it. Meanwhile, not only is the bill not going to create jobs, but think about all the payroll taxes that are lost based on the jobs that already exist. So the government's going to lose all that money, and that's the deficits, and now it has to go in and borrow money, or the Fed has to print money. But either way, it's going to undermine the economy by raising the cost of capital, the cost of raw materials, or depriving small businesses of the resources that they might have needed to grow. But now they also have something which is even really crazy for the wounded warriors. Right? And I really feel sorry for our men in arms who are coming home from Iraq or Afghanistan with injuries. And I'm not really sure to what extent the injury needs to be to qualify you as a wounded warrior. But apparently, if you hire a wounded warrior, you get a $9,600 tax credit. Now, if that's a minimum wage job, it actually reduces the minimum wage. And again, I'm not sure. Maybe you don't get the full tax credit if it's a low-paying job. I haven't been able to find the answer to this yet. So if I'm wrong on this, you know, it's going to change the dynamics a little bit, but not the principle, with the exception maybe of the wounded warrior and this arbitrage opportunity. But with the wounded warrior, it reduces the minimum wage to negative $1.98 an hour. Negative $1.98. So this creates a real window of opportunity for some of these wounded warriors and their phony employers, because what they can do is they can basically accept all sorts of no-show jobs, and they can collect paychecks from multiple employers because they don't actually have to show up, because it's not costing the employer anything, because the employer is being paid to hire them. So that's how insane some of this stuff is, if in fact you can get this full tax credit. But the bottom line is it's all gimmicks. It's more stimulus. It isn't going to work. It fits the definition of insanity perfectly, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And, you know, I've got a commentary that I wrote today on Europac.net that covers this. I discussed it today on my radio show at SchiffRadio.com. And I am going to discuss these very issues on Capitol Hill in front of a joint committee in Congress, or committee Congress, on Tuesday. This will be the first time I've testified before Congress, and I'm going to tell them how to create jobs. More importantly, I'm going to let them know that it's Congress that's destroying jobs. And rather than trying to figure out how the government can help create new jobs, how about if they just stop destroying the jobs that we already have and remove all the impediments and disincentives that exist that are preventing new jobs from being created. Anyway, have a great weekend, everybody. And again, let's commemorate and honor the people who died 10 years ago on Sunday, September 11th, 2001. That's it for today. This is Peter Schiff, SchiffRadio.com. Don't forget to tune in.